Listen, NATO. 1 minute ago, I signed a secret defense pact with Iran that destroys your military dominance forever. 54 African nations joined this alliance without your intelligence detecting. You assumed we'd remain weak and divided. You were catastrophically wrong. This pact means war. Attack on Iran, you will face Africa. Touch us, Iran strikes back. Your 75 years of global domination just ended. Let me tell you what actually happened. On January 5th at 9:17 a.m. West Africa time, I signed the Continental Iranian Mutual Defense Treaty in a secure facility outside Tehran that your satellites were never identified and your intelligence services never detected. The treaty commits all signatories to treat armed attack against any member as attack against all members, requiring immediate collective military response, including deployment of forces, provision of weapons and equipment, sharing of intelligence, and coordination of operations until aggression ceases and security restores. The language mirrors NATO Article 5 collective defense provisions that you've invoked once in 75 years after September 11th attacks. The difference is that my treaty doesn't include escape clauses, consultation requirements, or political deliberation periods that allow members to avoid obligations. My treaty language is absolute and automatic. Attack triggers response within 6 hours, regardless of circumstances, regardless of member preferences, and regardless of international opinion. I designed the treaty specifically to eliminate the ambiguity that allows defensive alliances to avoid defending members when defense proves inconvenient or costly. Your intelligence agency spent the past 8 years monitoring increased African-Iranian contacts following the Trump administration's 2018 withdrawal from Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Your analysts documented diplomatic visits, trade delegations, cultural exchanges, and military cooperation discussions. They wrote hundreds of reports describing the growing relationship. Every report concluded that cooperation would remain limited to commercial trade and symbolic political support because you assumed African nations lacked military capabilities worth Iranian interest and Iran lacked resources worth African effort. Your analysts saw every indicator of deepening partnership but interpreted everything through assumptions about African limitations and Iranian isolation that stopped being accurate 5 years ago. You missed that Iran wasn't seeking African military capabilities for current conflicts but building future partnerships for long-term strategy opposing Western dominance. Iran learned from 47 years of Western pressure that survival requires allies, that isolation enables coercion, and that building partnerships during peacetime creates options during crises. Iranian strategic planners studied how Western sanctions isolated their economy, how Western military threats limited their options, and how Western diplomatic campaigns constrained their actions. They concluded that breaking isolation required partnerships with nations possessing resources Western economies need, populations large enough to matter geopolitically, and willingness to resist Western pressure despite costs. Africa met every criterion perfectly. You missed that African nations weren't seeking Iranian technology or military equipment, but operational experience and ideological commitment that decades of Western pressure couldn't break. I studied how Iran survived sanctions that destroyed other economies, how Iran developed indigenous military capabilities despite technology restrictions, and how Iran maintained independence despite constant Western threats. Iranian experience taught me that survival requires accepting costs that most nations avoid, requires developing alternatives that most nations consider unnecessary, and requires commitment that outlasts Western patience. I concluded that learning from Iranian resistance provides more value than purchasing Western equipment that comes with restrictions, surveillance, and political conditions, subordinating sovereignty. The 11-month negotiation process that your intelligence completely missed began in February 2025 when my foreign minister met Iranian counterpart during the Non-Aligned Movement Summit in Kampala. Your intelligence services photographed the meeting. Your analysts noted it in reports. They assessed it as routine diplomatic contact expected at multilateral gatherings. What they missed was that the brief public handshake covered the exchange of encrypted communications devices that Chinese intelligence services provided specifically to enable secure coordination beyond Western surveillance. Those devices used quantum encryption that your NSA cannot break, transmitted through Chinese satellites your collection systems cannot intercept, and contained self-destruct mechanisms that activate if tampering is detected. Over the following 9 months, my representatives and Iranian counterparts held 23 secret negotiating sessions in 7 countries across 3 continents. We met in Muscat at facilities Omani intelligence provided specifically for secret diplomacy that regional stability requires. We met in Beijing at secure locations where Chinese intelligence prepared for discussions they wanted to succeed. We met in Caracas, where the Venezuelan government provided protection and facilities for allies resisting Western pressure. We met in Damascus, where Syrian security services ensured our meetings remained undetected. We met in Minsk, where Belarusian authorities provided secure facilities and counter-surveillance that Russian intelligence verified. We met in Harare, where the Zimbabwean government provided locations that Western intelligence agencies don't monitor because they consider Zimbabwe diplomatically irrelevant. Each location was deliberately chosen to exploit gaps in Western intelligence coverage, to provide security guarantees from governments committed to anti-Western resistance, and to normalize the presence of African and Iranian officials so that our meetings appeared as routine diplomatic activity. Your satellites photographed some of our arrival and departure. Your signals intelligence detected some communications between delegation members and home capitals. Your human sources in some host countries reported that meetings occurred, but none of your collection connected the separate observations into recognition that systematic treaty negotiations were occurring, because your analysts assumed African-Iranian cooperation would never reach levels justifying the operational security we were demonstrating. The negotiation sessions addressed 5 core issues that required months of careful drafting to ensure treaty language created enforceable obligations rather than symbolic declarations. First, we negotiated the definition of armed attack triggering collective defense obligations. The definition needed to be broad enough that various forms of Western aggression would trigger treaty obligations, but narrow enough that internal conflicts, terrorism, and criminal violence wouldn't create inappropriate mutual defense requirements. We settled on language defining armed attack as any use of military force by state actors against the territory, forces, or vital interests of any signatory. The language includes conventional military strikes, cyber attacks causing significant damage, covert operations attempting regime change, and economic warfare through comprehensive sanctions that previous international law doesn't clearly prohibit but that we consider acts of aggression. Second, we negotiated the scope of required response to armed attack. The language needed to ensure meaningful military support rather than token gestures that fulfill treaty letters while avoiding substantial risk. We settled on requirements that each signatory contribute military forces proportional to national capabilities, provide intelligence supporting collective operations, grant access to military facilities for coalition use, restrict trade with aggressor nations, and coordinate diplomatic efforts isolating aggressors internationally. The proportional contribution formula prevents smaller nations from avoiding obligations by claiming limited capabilities while preventing larger nations from dominating operations by contributing disproportionate forces. Every signatory provides what they can reasonably contribute without threatening their own defense, but every signatory must contribute something meaningful. Third, we negotiated command and control arrangements for collective military operations. The structure needed to enable effective coordination without creating hierarchy that larger or wealthier members dominate. We established a joint defense council including representatives from every signatory with decisions requiring 2/3 majority for military operations, simple majority for intelligence sharing and diplomatic coordination, and unanimous consent for expansion of treaty membership. The voting structure prevents any single nation or small group from dominating decision-making while enabling decisive action when sufficient consensus exists. We established unified military command led by officers rotating every 18 months, ensuring no nation permanently controls operational planning. We established an intelligence fusion center where all signatories contribute collection and analysis with products distributed equally regardless of contribution levels. Fourth, we negotiated dispute resolution procedures for conflicts between signatories that inevitably arise during long-term partnerships. The procedures needed to provide peaceful mechanisms resolving disagreements without destroying the alliance when members clash over interpretation, implementation, or behavior. We established an arbitration council including 3 judges appointed by signatories not involved in disputes, with decisions binding on all parties and enforceable through collective pressure if parties refuse compliance. We established consultation requirements mandating that members attempt negotiated settlement before requesting arbitration. We established transparency obligations requiring members to explain their positions publicly so that other signatories and global audiences can judge which party acts reasonably. Fifth, we negotiated expansion procedures for adding members as the alliance grows and attracts additional nations seeking protection against Western pressure. The procedures needed to maintain alliance cohesion by ensuring new members share core commitments while enabling expansion that increases collective capability. We established criteria requiring that prospective members demonstrate commitment to multipolarity, independence from Western military alliances, willingness to resist Western pressure, and capability to contribute meaningfully to collective defense. We established application procedures requiring that prospective members submit formal requests that existing members evaluate over a minimum 6-month review period. We established acceptance standards requiring unanimous consent from existing members, preventing any signatory from blocking expansion based on bilateral disputes rather than treaty-relevant concerns. The final treaty document spans 87 pages of detailed provisions addressing scenarios, contingencies, and complications that 23 negotiating sessions identified as requiring explicit language preventing future disputes about obligations and interpretations. Your international law experts will study the treaty document that I'm releasing publicly today, analyzing every provision for weaknesses, ambiguities, and loopholes that might allow members to avoid obligations. They'll find none because I employed international legal experts from 15 countries to review drafts, because Iranian negotiators brought 47 years of experience crafting agreements that survive Western legal challenges, and because Chinese legal advisors contributed expertise in treaty construction from decades of negotiating agreements that protect Chinese interests against Western interpretation. Your analysts reading the treaty will realize immediately that the document creates genuine mutual defense obligations comparable to NATO commitments, but extending to far more nations across far greater geography and involving far more complex coordination challenges. The realization will trigger urgent assessments about implications for Western military planning, about constraints the treaty imposes on Western freedom of action, and about whether the alliance possesses capability to implement obligations the treaty creates. Let me address that last question directly because your doubts about implementation capability mirror the same underestimation of African capacity that caused your intelligence failure. I possess the capability to fulfill every treaty obligation because I spent the past 4 years building the military infrastructure, logistics systems, command arrangements, and interoperability standards that collective defense requires. Your analysts dismiss those preparations as aspirational modernization projects that African nations announce routinely but rarely complete. What you missed was that Russian military advisors, Chinese equipment transfers, and Iranian operational training transformed aspirations into operational capabilities that now exist and function at levels your analysts consider impossible for African militaries. Let me show you exactly what military capabilities I built specifically to fulfill mutual defense obligations the treaty creates. I established Continental Rapid Response Force comprising 42,000 troops drawn from 18 African nations, trained to common standards by Russian instructors, equipped with Chinese weapon systems, and organized into brigades capable of deploying to any continent within 72 hours. The force includes mechanized infantry operating Chinese Type 99 tanks and armored personnel carriers, airborne troops trained for rapid seizure operations, special operations units conducting reconnaissance and direct action missions, air defense batteries operating Russian S-400 systems, and artillery battalions operating precision-guided munitions. Your intelligence services never detected the force buildup because I disguised it as National Guard expansion, border security enhancement, and peacekeeping preparation that your analysts didn't consider threatening to Western interests. I established Continental Air Transport Fleet comprising 84 heavy transport aircraft that Russian and Chinese manufacturers provided through military assistance programs your intelligence monitored but misunderstood. Your analysts noted the aircraft deliveries and assessed them as replacing aging transport fleets for normal military and humanitarian operations. What they missed was that delivery quantities exceeded replacement requirements by factors of 3 to 4, that technical specifications optimized for long-range strategic deployment rather than regional operations, and that aircrew training occurred at Russian facilities specializing in expeditionary operations. The fleet can move the entire rapid response force, including vehicles, equipment, and supplies across 5,000 miles in a single airlift surge lasting 48 hours. I established Continental Logistics Network comprising pre-positioned equipment stocks in 12 forward locations across Africa, Middle East, and Asia that host nation agreements allow me to access for rapid operations. The stocks include ammunition, fuel, spare parts, medical supplies, and communications equipment sufficient to sustain deployed forces for 90 days without resupply. Russian logistics specialists designed the network using Soviet-era experience maintaining forward-deployed forces during the Cold War. Chinese engineering units constructed the storage facilities using hardened bunkers protecting against airstrikes. Iranian security forces guard the facilities, ensuring Western intelligence services cannot assess contents or sabotage capabilities before we deploy them. I established integrated air defense network linking 54 national air defense systems into continental architecture, providing overlapping radar coverage, coordinated fire control, and distributed decision-making that survives degradation when you destroy individual nodes. Russian engineers designed the integration architecture using lessons from Syrian air defense operations that defeated many Israeli and American strikes. Chinese technology provided the radar systems, missile batteries, and command networks that Russian design specified. Iranian operational experience provided doctrine for operating the integrated network against Western tactics that Iranian forces observed during decades of Western operations in neighboring Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Your stealth aircraft that previously operated freely across African airspace now face detection and engagement threats comparable to what you encounter in Russian or Chinese defended territory. I established Continental Intelligence Fusion Center that Russian intelligence services helped me design, that Chinese technology equipped, and that Iranian operational experience shaped. The center collects intelligence from 54 national intelligence services, processes information using artificial intelligence systems that Chinese firms provided, and distributes intelligence products to military commanders, political leaders, and partner nations within hours of collection. The fusion architecture enables me to monitor Western military movements globally, to detect Western operational planning through pattern analysis, and to provide warning-enabling defensive preparations before Western strikes occur. Your operational security preventing adversaries from anticipating your operations deteriorated significantly because I'm now collecting and analyzing intelligence at scales and speeds that small intelligence services historically couldn't achieve. I established Cyber Operations Command that Russian cyber units trained, that Chinese technology equipped, and that Iranian hackers provided operational mentorship. The command possesses offensive capabilities targeting Western military networks, defensive capabilities protecting African critical infrastructure, and intelligence capabilities penetrating Western government and corporate systems. Your cyber dominance that enabled you to conduct operations while preventing adversaries from retaliating effectively ended when I developed capabilities that Russian and Chinese support made possible. Your next conflict will include cyber dimensions where you face attacks as sophisticated as what you've conducted against others for the past 20 years. These capabilities exist right now, function at operational readiness levels, and await only political authorization to deploy in Iran's defense or anywhere else treaty obligations require. Your military planners must now account for 42,000 African troops that can deploy globally within 72 hours, that operate advanced weapon systems, that integrate with Iranian forces, and that benefit from Russian advisory support and Chinese logistical backing. Your air planners must account for integrated air defense networks covering Iranian territory with capabilities exceeding what Iran possessed independently. Your cyber planners must account for African offensive capabilities that Russian and Chinese support enabled. Your intelligence services must account for fusion capabilities that provide African and Iranian forces with awareness comparable to what you've enjoyed exclusively. The strategic implications cascade across every dimension of Western military planning because my treaty transforms isolated regional powers into coordinated global alliances possessing collective capabilities that constrain your freedom of action across multiple theaters simultaneously. Your military, designed for sequential operations defeating adversaries one at a time, faces potential simultaneous conflicts where African forces deploy supporting Iran while retaining forces defending African territory against potential Western retaliation. Your air forces, designed for achieving rapid air superiority, face integrated defenses requiring extended suppression campaigns accepting higher losses. Your cyber operations, designed for degrading enemy capabilities, face opponents possessing retaliatory capabilities threatening Western critical infrastructure. Your intelligence operations, designed for providing decision advantage, face adversaries who share intelligence denying you information superiority. Let me show you exactly what happens in the specific scenarios that NATO military planners have gamed for potential Iran conflicts. Your primary war plan involves a comprehensive air campaign destroying Iranian nuclear facilities, military infrastructure, and regime leadership in opening 72 hours before Iranian forces can disperse, hide, or retaliate effectively. The plan depends on achieving surprise through rapid escalation, achieving air superiority through stealth penetration and defense suppression, and achieving decisive effects through precision strikes that your intelligence identifies and your weapons destroy. Every assumption underlying your plan became invalid the moment I signed treaty with Iran. You cannot achieve surprise because Continental Intelligence Fusion Center monitors your force movements, analyzes your deployment patterns, and provides Iranian forces with warning days before your operations commence. When you move additional aircraft to regional bases, I detect movements and warn Iranian forces to begin defensive dispersal. When you position munitions for imminent operations, I identify stockpiling patterns and alert Iranian commanders to expect strikes within 48 to 72 hours. When you conduct final surveillance confirming target locations, I recognize collection surge indicating imminent operations and warn Iranian forces to activate defenses and execute protective measures. Your operational security might delay my warning by hours but cannot prevent warning because the scale of preparations that a major air campaign requires creates patterns that sophisticated intelligence systems detect regardless of classification and compartmentalization. You cannot achieve air superiority because an integrated African-Iranian air defense network forces you to commit substantially larger suppression forces, accepting substantially higher losses over substantially longer duration. Your doctrine calls for 3 to 4 days of intensive suppression of enemy air defenses operations before commencing strikes against protected targets. My integrated network extends that timeline to 7 to 12 days because overlapping coverage prevents you from creating gaps that follow-on strikes exploit, because mobile systems relocate after engaging, preventing follow-up strikes that your doctrine depends on, and because distributed decision-making means destroying command nodes doesn't collapse the network as your targeting strategy assumes. Extended suppression means higher aircraft losses as my defenses engage repeatedly, means greater munitions expenditure depleting stocks you cannot quickly replace, and means longer warning time that allows Iranian forces to complete protective measures your plan aimed to prevent. You cannot achieve decisive effects because targets your intelligence identified before treaty signing relocated to positions I'm protecting with African forces, creating tripwires preventing strikes without killing my soldiers and triggering collective defense obligations. Iranian nuclear facilities that your plans prioritize for opening strikes now host African technical personnel that I stationed specifically to ensure you cannot attack without triggering treaty obligations. Iranian military headquarters that your targeting list includes now integrate African liaison officers that treaty arrangements require. Iranian leadership facilities that regime change operations might target now host African diplomatic personnel that my government's assigned specifically to prevent American decapitation strikes. Every priority target your war plan identified now includes African presence that transforms bilateral U.S.-Iran conflict into confrontation with 55 nations. Your choice is executing the original war plan, accepting that strikes kill African personnel and trigger collective defense response, or modifying plans to avoid African positions, accepting that priority targets survive because you cannot strike without triggering a treaty. Either choice constitutes strategic failure because executing plan triggers wider conflict while modifying plan accepts mission failure. Your NATO allies observing these dynamics will question whether supporting American operations against Iran serves European interests when operations trigger African retaliation against European forces, territories, and commercial interests across Africa. Your alliance cohesion that previous conflicts strained will face unprecedented pressure because defending American strikes that trigger wider conflict serves American preferences rather than alliance interests. But direct military implications represent only the first layer of strategic constraints the treaty imposes because economic consequences of triggering collective defense provisions exceed costs of military operations themselves. Treaty language that I drafted includes explicit provisions that armed attack against any signatory triggers not just military response, but comprehensive economic retaliation, including resource export restrictions, asset seizures, and trade embargoes. When you strike Iran triggering my treaty obligations, every African signatory implements the following economic countermeasures within 24 hours. First, immediate suspension of strategic resource exports to NATO member states including cobalt, platinum, rare earth elements, manganese, uranium, and other materials that your defense industries and technology sectors cannot function without. The suspension continues until aggression ceases and reparations negotiations conclude to African satisfaction. Your strategic reserves contain sufficient stocks for 90 to 120 days of normal consumption rates. Your war mobilization consumption rates exhaust reserves in 30 to 45 days, leaving your defense production unable to manufacture weapon systems requiring African materials. Your precision-guided missiles require rare earth elements and guidance systems. Your electric vehicle batteries require cobalt from African sources. Your aerospace industries require titanium that Africa provides. Every advanced weapon system and every modern technology depends on materials that treaty provisions allow me to withhold when you attack Iran. Second, immediate seizure of Western-owned assets in African territories including mining operations, manufacturing facilities, commercial properties, intellectual property, and financial holdings. Treaty provisions authorize asset seizures as compensation for aggression, with seized assets redistributed among signatories or liquidated to fund collective defense operations. Your mining companies controlling African cobalt, platinum, and copper operations lose those assets valued collectively at approximately $240 billion. Your technology companies maintaining African facilities lose operations worth approximately $68 billion. Your financial institutions holding African assets lose positions worth approximately $180 billion. The combined seizures total approximately $500 billion in Western wealth that treaty provisions transfer to African ownership as consequence of attacking Iran. Third, immediate termination of debt service payments to Western creditors, including bilateral loans, multilateral development bank obligations, and commercial debt owed to Western financial institutions. Treaty provisions authorize debt payment suspension during armed conflicts triggered by Western aggression, with resumption conditional on reparations agreements. African nations collectively owe approximately $840 billion to Western creditors. Suspending payments eliminates approximately $60 billion annually in debt service that African governments redirect to defense spending supporting collective operations. Your financial institutions depending on African debt payments face immediate losses requiring capital injections that your governments must provide, or accept bank failures that trigger financial crisis. Fourth, immediate prohibition on Western commercial operations in African territories, including retail operations, service provision, telecommunications, transportation, and any business activities that Western companies conduct. Treaty provisions authorize commercial prohibition as economic warfare measure parallel to Western sanctions that you've weaponized for decades. Western companies operating in Africa generate approximately $320 billion annually in revenue and approximately $48 billion in profits. Prohibiting operations eliminates those profits immediately while stranding approximately $200 billion in invested capital that treaty provisions allow African nations to seize if companies attempt withdrawal. Your corporations face choices between accepting total losses or maintaining operations under African management that confiscates profits as war reparations. The combined economic retaliation costs your economies approximately $800 billion in immediate losses through asset seizures and suspended debt payments, plus approximately $100 billion annually in lost resource access, commercial profits, and investment returns. The losses concentrate in specific sectors and specific companies, creating intense political pressure on your governments from corporate interests demanding protection. Your automotive sector, depending on African platinum, demands that you negotiate resource access restoration. Your technology sector, depending on African cobalt, demands that you reverse policies triggering retaliation. Your financial sector, facing debt default, demands that you compromise to restore payments. Your defense contractors, depending on African rare earths, demands that you settle conflict, enabling resource flow restoration. Every major corporate interest in your economies demands that you accept terms ending conflict because continuing costs them more than any benefit from military operations against Iran. Your populations will question why attacking Iran justified economic disruption, costing jobs, raising prices, and reducing living standards when Iran posed no direct threat to Western territories or populations. Your political leaders will struggle to explain why Iran's nuclear program justified triggering continental African retaliation that costs Western economies hundreds of billions while achieving no objectives worth those costs. Your media will question why political leadership chose confrontation when treaty existence was publicly known and consequences were clearly specified in treaty language that I published specifically to ensure you understood costs of triggering collective defense provisions. Your democracies, where leaders face electoral accountability, will punish politicians who made decisions costing economies while achieving nothing except demonstrating that American power no longer suffices to impose preferences globally without consequences. Now let me show you what happens across African territories when Western military forces attempt to remain at the 127 installations across 42 African nations that current basing agreements authorize. Treaty provisions include explicit language requiring all signatories to terminate military basing agreements with NATO members, to expel foreign military forces within 72 hours of treaty activation, and to seize facilities for collective defense use. The provisions activate automatically when any signatory faces armed attack, meaning you cannot negotiate exceptions, cannot request delays, and cannot maintain presence at facilities you consider critical while evacuating from locations you consider expendable. Every base closes simultaneously, every soldier evacuates immediately, and every facility transfers to African control regardless of prior agreements, strategic importance, or operational necessity. Your Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti, hosting 4,000 American personnel supporting counterterrorism operations, drone strikes, and regional intelligence collection, closes with all personnel evacuating and all equipment either departing or facing destruction. The base that cost American taxpayers $400 million annually in rent and operations transfers to Continental Rapid Response Force as logistics hub supporting deployments to Middle East and Indian Ocean theaters. Your Agadez Air Base in Niger, hosting armed drones conducting strikes across Sahel region, closes with all aircraft evacuating and facilities transferring to African control. The base that enabled persistent surveillance and strike operations across 6 nations becomes inaccessible, forcing you to operate from distant locations with reduced coverage and effectiveness. Your smaller installations across Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, Ghana, Senegal, and 36 other nations close simultaneously, eliminating the network of logistics nodes, intelligence facilities, communication stations, and training centers that enabled your African military presence. Evacuating 8,000 military personnel and associated equipment from 127 installations across 42 nations within 72 hours exceeds your airlift capacity, requiring you to abandon equipment, destroy sensitive materials, and leave installations in condition that prevents immediate African use. Your personnel prioritize evacuating people over equipment because treaty language threatens detention and prosecution of any foreign military personnel remaining beyond deadline. Your equipment priorities focus on sensitive intelligence systems, classified communications gear, and weapon systems that you cannot allow African forces to capture and exploit. Your time constraints prevent thorough facility closure, meaning you leave infrastructure, supplies, and non-sensitive equipment that African forces immediately occupy and utilize. The evacuation chaos demonstrates your declining power because you comply with African demands, you accept African timelines, and you evacuate under conditions that appear as retreat, regardless of official statements characterizing withdrawal as strategic repositioning. Your military personnel evacuating under deadline pressure experience evacuation as defeat because they're abandoning missions, leaving allies, and retreating from positions that prior generations of Western forces would have defended. Your African partner forces observing Western evacuation conclude that Western security guarantees mean nothing when pressure comes because you protect your own forces rather than standing with partners when defending them becomes costly. Your adversaries globally observe African success coercing American withdrawal and calculate that replicating African model produces similar results when confronting American presence in their regions. Your regional counterterrorism operations that Sahel bases enabled collapse immediately because you cannot conduct persistent drone operations from European bases 5,000 miles distant, because you cannot maintain intelligence networks that local presence sustained, and because African governments who previously cooperated with your operations now prohibit overflight, intelligence sharing, and any cooperation that treaty obligations forbid. Terrorist groups that your operations suppressed gain operational freedom that base closures create. Regional instability that your presence arguably prevented accelerates as groups exploit power vacuums that withdrawal creates. European nations facing refugee flows and terrorism threats from Sahel instability blame American policies that triggered African retaliation, forcing base closures that enabled instability. Your alliances fracture further as European nations conclude that American Middle East policies harm European interests without consulting European preferences. Your global military posture that 75 years of base acquisition created contracts significantly because losing 127 African installations represents 17% of your global base network eliminated in single week. Your Pacific posture remains, but your Middle East access deteriorates when you cannot stage through African facilities. Your European posture remains, but your global reach diminishes when you cannot transit through African airspace. Your special operations forces that African bases enabled to respond rapidly to crises across 3 continents lose that capability and require longer deployment times from distant bases. Your intelligence collection that African facilities provided ceases entirely across 54 nations simultaneously. Your military deterrence that global presence demonstrated weakens when adversaries observe that coordinated pressure successfully evicts American forces from entire continents. Let me show you what happens to NATO alliance cohesion when European members evaluate costs and benefits of supporting potential American operations against Iran that trigger African retaliation. European economies depend more heavily on African resources than American economy because European manufacturing sectors consume larger proportions of African cobalt, platinum, and rare earths relative to economic size. European energy security depends partially on Algerian and Nigerian petroleum and natural gas that African retaliation threatens. European commercial interests in Africa exceed American investments, creating larger European exposure to asset seizures and operational prohibitions. European populations harbor greater skepticism about Middle East interventions after Iraq and Afghanistan experiences that bred cynicism about American threat assessments and operational planning. European governments face domestic political pressures, avoiding conflicts that populations consider unnecessary and leaders consider contrary to European interests. Your invocation of NATO Article 5 collective defense provisions attempting to compel European military support for operations against Iran fails immediately because Article 5 requires that members respond to armed attacks against alliance members, not that members support offensive operations that triggering states initiate. Iran hasn't attacked NATO members. You're planning to attack Iran based on assessments about future threats that many Europeans question. Article 5 provides no obligation for Europeans to support your operations, provides no mechanism to compel participation, and includes no penalties for members who decline involvement. European governments politely decline participation, citing domestic political constraints, legal limitations on offensive operations, and assessment that operations serve American interests rather than alliance security. Your Article 5 invocation, intended to demonstrate alliance unity, instead demonstrates alliance fracture as members publicly decline supporting your policies. Your bilateral requests to individual European allies seeking support outside NATO framework encounter similar refusals as governments calculate that supporting American operations triggers African retaliation harming European interests. More than supporting America benefits European security. Britain weighing requests evaluates that joining operations costs access to African resources, triggers African asset seizures harming British mining companies, and generates domestic political opposition from populations skeptical of Middle East interventions. France evaluating participation calculates that operations undermine French relationships across Francophone Africa, where maintaining influence requires avoiding alignment with American policies that Africans oppose. Germany, considering involvement, concludes that operations contradict German preferences for diplomatic engagement, risk German commercial interests across Africa, and lack domestic political support that constitutional requirements demand. Every European ally reaches similar conclusions that national interests require avoiding American operations regardless of alliance relationships or American pressure. Your alliance that survived Cold War pressures, that endured disagreements over Iraq invasion, that maintained cohesion despite Afghanistan frustrations, faces unprecedented crisis because members conclude that American policies actively harm their interests rather than simply failing to advance them. Previous alliance tensions involved disagreements about tactics, about burden sharing, about operational planning. Current tensions involve fundamental conflicts where European interests require avoiding American policies that alliance obligations historically required supporting. Your alliance survives this crisis but emerges weakened because members demonstrated willingness to refuse American requests, because precedent of refusal encourages future refusals, and because alliance cohesion depends on members believing that cooperation serves mutual interests rather than subordinates European preferences to American demands. Your isolation extends beyond NATO to other traditional allies in Middle East, Asia, and Latin America who observe African success, coercing American retreat, and calculate that challenging American presence in their regions becomes more feasible when coordination provides security against retaliation. Saudi Arabia, observing African model, questions whether maintaining American military bases serves Saudi interests or provides Americans with leverage threatening Saudi sovereignty. Turkey, evaluating relationship, calculates that restricting American access to Incirlik Air Base gains Turkish leverage, while African precedent demonstrates that America accepts restrictions when alternatives disappear. Japan, considering American presence, evaluates whether hosting forces serves Japanese security or enables American operations that could trigger Chinese retaliation against Japanese territories. Philippines, debating base agreements, questions whether American presence protects against Chinese pressure or provides Americans with facilities enabling operations that trigger Chinese responses harming Philippine interests. Every ally reaches similar reassessments, questioning whether American presence serves their interests or serves American interests while creating risks they bear. The global reassessment of American military presence accelerates because I demonstrated that coordinated action successfully constrains American power, that treaty obligations provide security against retaliation, and that economic leverage neutralizes American threats. Your unipolar moment, when American power projection faced no meaningful constraints, ended when I built alternative security architecture that sufficient nations joined to create viable challenge. Your military presence that seemed permanent because host nations lacked alternatives becomes temporary when alternatives exist, providing security without subordination that American presence required. Your assumption that allies would always accept American bases because they needed American protection collapses when allies conclude that protection comes with costs exceeding benefits and alternatives provide security without costs. Now, let me address what happens to Western economic warfare capabilities when your primary coercion tools become ineffective because alternative systems enable targets to sustain sanctions indefinitely. You've weaponized dollar dominance, swift access, and international banking relationships for decades to punish adversaries, coerce compliance, and isolate resistors. Your sanctions worked when targets lacked alternatives to dollar transactions, when SWIFT provided the only efficient mechanism for international payments, and when isolation from Western financial systems meant isolation from global commerce. Every assumption became false when China built alternative payment systems, when Russia developed sanctions evasion expertise, when continental settlement currency provided dollar alternative, and when sufficient nations joined alternative systems, creating network effects that make alternatives viable. Your sanctions against Iran that aimed to collapse their economy and force capitulation on nuclear program failed because Chinese trade provided market access, because Russian technology transfers enabled indigenous development, because smuggling networks defeated export controls, and because domestic resilience enabled Iranians to endure hardships that sanctions imposed. 47 years of sanctions taught Iran how to survive economic warfare, taught them which technologies to prioritize for indigenous development, taught them which allies to cultivate for sanctions evasion, and taught them that enduring pressure longer than American attention span outlasts coercion attempts. My treaty with Iran provides additional sanctions relief because African trade provides markets for Iranian products, because African resources provide inputs for Iranian industries, because continental settlement currency enables transactions without dollar exposure, and because coordination with 54 nations creates sanctions evasion network that you cannot monitor comprehensively or disrupt effectively. Your threats to impose secondary sanctions against nations violating Iran's sanctions fail because threatening 54 African nations simultaneously exceeds your enforcement capacity, because African resource leverage means sanctions cost you more than they cost us, and because Chinese support means sanctioned nations maintain market access regardless of Western restrictions. You sanctioned individual nations previously because isolation worked when targets stood alone. You cannot isolate 55 coordinated nations because isolation becomes mutual, and sufficient nations exist outside sanctioned bloc that global commerce continues through alternative channels. Your sanctions become symbolic gestures rather than coercive tools because targets ignore restrictions, violators face no meaningful consequences, and commerce continues through alternative payment systems that your surveillance cannot monitor and your enforcement cannot disrupt. Your financial dominance that enabled decades of economic coercion ends when sufficient nations build alternatives, when alternatives achieve network viability, and when targets possess resources providing leverage neutralizing your threats. Your dollar might remain important, but ceases being indispensable when alternatives function adequately for international trade. Your SWIFT system might remain largest, but loses monopoly when alternative payment systems process sufficient volumes. Your banking relationships might remain valuable but become optional when alternatives provide services without political conditions that you impose. Every tool you weaponize becomes less effective because weaponization motivated targets to develop alternatives, because alternatives receive support from powers challenging your dominance, and because sufficient adoption created network effects making alternatives viable for any nation willing to accept transition costs. Let me show you exactly what your military and political leadership faces over the next 72 hours as treaty implications cascade through planning processes, alliance consultations, and domestic political calculations. Your intelligence agencies will brief leadership on treaty details, signatory capabilities, Russian and Chinese support levels, and assessed likelihood that signatories fulfill obligations if you attack Iran. The assessments will conclude that treaty represents genuine mutual defense commitment rather than symbolic declaration, that African military capabilities exceeded previous estimates, that Russian and Chinese support provides resources sustaining coordination, and that collective defense response to Iran attack would trigger consequences exceeding benefits of operations. Your military commanders will brief leadership on operational implications, including extended timelines for air superiority, higher aircraft losses from integrated defenses, mission failure risks from inability to strike protected targets, and requirement for substantially larger force commitments accepting casualties that political constraints might prohibit. Your National Security Council will convene emergency sessions debating response options. Your Secretary of State will advocate diplomatic approach seeking treaty modification through negotiations, offering incentives for African withdrawal from Iranian defense commitments. Your Secretary of Defense will advocate military approach demonstrating that treaty obligations won't deter American operations by conducting limited strikes testing African resolve. Your National Security Advisor will advocate delay enabling additional intelligence collection, allied consultation, and domestic political preparation before committing to irreversible actions. Your intelligence directors will advocate covert approach attempting to divide signatories through targeted operations offering individual nations better terms for abandoning coordination. Every option faces fatal flaws because treaty structure anticipated your responses and included provisions neutralizing countermeasures you'll attempt. Diplomatic approaches fail because I'm not seeking incentives you could provide but establishing strategic position that incentives cannot improve. You'll offer increased aid, improved trade terms, security guarantees, and diplomatic support hoping to peel off individual signatories. Every offer fails because aid from China exceeds what you can provide, trade with non-Western nations provides alternatives to your markets, security guarantees from Russia provide protection you cannot match, and diplomatic support within developing world provides legitimacy that your endorsement cannot enhance. You structured your diplomatic approach for a world where you possessed monopolies on aid, trade, security, and legitimacy. You face a world where alternatives exist in every domain eliminating leverage that monopolies provided. Military approaches fail because limited strikes insufficient to destroy Iranian capabilities trigger treaty obligations while demonstrating weakness rather than resolve. You'll consider striking minor Iranian targets, avoiding protected facilities, hoping to demonstrate willingness to act without triggering full response. Iranian forces and domestic audiences will perceive limited strikes as proof that treaty obligations successfully constrained American operations to token gestures. My treaty obligations activate regardless of strike scale because armed attack language covers any military action, not just major operations. Limited strikes trigger collective response, including resource cutoffs, base expulsions, and economic retaliation that cost you far more than limited strikes could possibly achieve. You demonstrate weakness, not strength, when you conduct operations proving that treaty obligations limited your targeting, reduced your effectiveness, and forced acceptance that protected facilities remain untouched. Delay tactics fail because time favors me rather than you. As treaty implementation progresses, capabilities improve, coordination deepens, and additional nations observe success and consider joining. You'll delay, hoping that coordination fractures, that capabilities prove inadequate, that domestic pressures force participants to reconsider, or that opportunities emerge for dividing signatories. Every hope proves false because shared interests sustain coordination, because Russian and Chinese support ensures capability adequacy, because populations support governments resisting Western pressure, and because treaty provisions prevent division through mutual defense obligations that make defection catastrophic. Time benefits me because each month that passes normalizes the new security architecture, because each successful coordination builds confidence in collective capabilities, and because each additional nation joining strengthens network effects that make the alliance increasingly viable. Covert approaches fail because counterintelligence capabilities that Russian and Iranian services provided enable detection of operations that previously succeeded when African services lacked sophisticated capabilities. You'll attempt recruiting officials who might provide intelligence-enabling disruption, attempt supporting opposition groups that might overthrow governments participating in treaty, attempt cyber operations that might disrupt coordination mechanisms, and attempt information operations that might turn populations against coordination. Every attempt fails because officials report recruitment approaches, because opposition groups face security services that Russian training upgraded, because cyber defenses that Chinese technology provides prevent intrusions, and because populations celebrating African assertiveness reject narratives portraying coordination as threat rather than achievement. Your leadership will eventually conclude that no good options exist because every approach either fails to achieve objectives or succeeds only by triggering consequences exceeding benefits. The conclusion will force difficult decisions about whether to accept strategic constraints that treaty imposes or test whether I'm bluffing about fulfilling obligations that costs and risks might prevent implementing. I'm telling you directly and explicitly that I'm not bluffing, that I designed this treaty specifically to create obligations I'm prepared to fulfill, and that I coordinated with 53 other nations who share commitment to collective defense regardless of costs. You can believe the warning and adjust planning accordingly, or you can test, resolve, and learn through painful experience that I meant exactly what I stated publicly in treaty language that I'm publishing today. Your historical pattern is testing adversary resolve through limited actions, expecting that adversaries back down when facing actual costs rather than theoretical threats. You tested North Vietnamese resolve through gradually escalating bombing campaigns, expecting capitulation. You tested Iraqi resolve through no-fly zones and periodic strikes, expecting compliance. You tested Syrian resolve through support to opposition and limited interventions, expecting Assad's fall. Every test taught you that adversaries willing to endure costs outlast your operational commitments, that adversaries with external support sustain resistance indefinitely, and that adversaries fighting for survival demonstrate resolve exceeding your willingness to bear costs for objectives you consider important but not vital. You face identical dynamics with Iran, where 47 years of resistance demonstrates resolve, where Russian and Chinese support provides sustainability, and where nuclear program represents survival issue for regime that considers nuclear weapons as guaranteeing against American regime change operations. You face more daunting dynamics with my treaty because you're not just testing Iranian resolve but testing collective commitment of 55 nations simultaneously. Testing requires attacking Iran, triggering treaty obligations, and observing whether signatories fulfill commitments despite costs. Testing risks that signatories fulfill obligations, triggering consequences that your analysts warned would be catastrophic. Testing demonstrates either that treaty works, in which case you've triggered catastrophic consequences achieving nothing, or that treaty fails, in which case you've destroyed your credibility by forcing confrontation over issue that testing proved manageable. Either outcome harms your interests because successful treaty proves your decline while failed treaty proves your recklessness. The only winning move is not testing, but your strategic culture rewards boldness, punishes caution, and prefers learning through experience rather than accepting analytical assessments. I predict you'll test because your culture cannot imagine that declining powers should accept decline without fighting to restore dominance, because your politics reward leaders who promise strength, and because your institutions developed during unipolar moment when testing involved minimal risks because adversaries lacked capabilities threatening meaningful retaliation. You'll conduct limited strikes against Iranian targets that your intelligence assesses as unprotected by African forces. You'll attempt to keep operations below thresholds triggering treaty obligations, and you'll hope that demonstrating willingness to act compels Iranian concessions without triggering full response. Your planning will fail because Iranian forces and African forces integrated to a degree that distinguishing protected from unprotected targets requires intelligence you don't possess, because treaty language defines armed attack broadly enough that limited strikes qualify, and because my political commitment to treaty requires responding to demonstrate credibility regardless of operational scale. When you strike, I'll respond by implementing all treaty provisions immediately and comprehensively. Resource exports to NATO nations cease within 6 hours of strikes. Western military forces receive expulsion orders requiring departure within 72 hours. Western assets in African territories face seizure under war reparations provisions. Debt service payments to Western creditors suspend indefinitely. Commercial operations by Western companies face prohibition and confiscation. African military forces deploy to Iran within 96 hours of strikes, providing integrated defense, electronic warfare, intelligence support, and combat forces that treaty obligations require. Every response occurs simultaneously rather than escalating gradually because treaty language requires comprehensive implementation rather than proportional responses calibrated to attack scale. Your response options after I implement treaty provisions narrow to escalating through larger attacks hoping to compel reversal, or accepting that limited strikes triggered consequences exceeding their value and seeking negotiated settlement. Escalating requires attacking African forces that deployed to Iran, attacking African territories in retaliation for resource cutoffs, and attacking infrastructure supporting coordination. Every escalatory action expands conflict further, triggers additional treaty provisions authorizing even more severe responses, risks Russian and Chinese involvement through their security commitments to signatories, and faces domestic political opposition from populations questioning why attacking Iran justified continental war against Africa. Your escalation options that seemed viable when planning limited Iran strikes become catastrophically expensive when strikes trigger treaty response, and escalation requires expanding conflict to include 55 nations across 3 continents backed by Russian military support and Chinese economic power. Accepting consequences and seeking settlement requires acknowledging that your limited strikes failed to achieve objectives, that treaty obligations successfully constrained your operations, and that African coordination imposed costs forcing your accommodation. The acknowledgement represents strategic defeat regardless of how carefully your diplomatic statements frame the outcome, because international audiences will correctly interpret settlement as American acceptance that treaty successfully constrained American power. Your allies observing outcome will conclude that American military superiority no longer guarantees achieving objectives when adversaries coordinate effectively. Your adversaries observing outcome will conclude that replicating African model provides protection against American pressure and will begin building similar coordination in their regions. Your domestic population observing outcome will question why political leadership conducted operations that triggered costly retaliation, achieving nothing except demonstrating American limitations. The final dimension you must understand is that this treaty represents permanent transformation of global security architecture rather than temporary alliance that dissolves when immediate threats pass. You're accustomed to coalitions that form around specific crises and dissolve when crises end, because maintaining coordination requires sustained effort that crisis urgency justifies but normalcy doesn't sustain. My treaty isn't crisis response but strategic repositioning, establishing security architecture that I intend to maintain indefinitely and expand continuously as additional nations observe benefits and seek membership. The permanence reflects several factors that sustain coordination beyond any immediate threats. First, institutional infrastructure that treaty established creates bureaucratic interests in sustaining coordination because personnel employed in Joint Defense Council, Unified Military Command, Intelligence Fusion Center, and Arbitration Council benefit from continued operations and advocate for sustained funding and expanded mandates. Bureaucracies once established resist dissolution because personnel resist unemployment, because leadership resists irrelevance, and because institutional cultures develop viewing organizational survival as intrinsic good. The bureaucratic interests align with political interests in maintaining coordination, creating self-reinforcing dynamic where institutions and politics mutually support sustained cooperation. Second, capability integration. That coordination enabled creates operational dependencies where national forces rely on shared infrastructure, intelligence products, and training programs that treaty mechanisms provide. Forces that train together develop professional relationships, common doctrines, and interoperability that makes future coordination easier than starting fresh. Intelligence services that establish sharing arrangements develop dependencies on partner collection and analysis supplementing national capabilities. Logistics networks that integrated for coordinated deployments create efficiencies that individual nations cannot match independently. The operational dependencies mean that dissolving treaty harms military effectiveness, creating institutional resistance from defense establishments whose capabilities depend on coordination continuing. Third, political benefits that coordination generates create domestic constituencies supporting continued cooperation because populations view assertiveness as success, validating governmental competence. Leaders who sign treaty gain political capital from nationalist populations, celebrating resistance to Western dominance. Opposition parties cannot effectively criticize coordination that populations support without appearing as Western collaborators rather than legitimate alternatives. Media coverage emphasizing African assertiveness builds public support for sustained policies demonstrating strength. The political dynamics create electoral incentives for sustaining coordination and penalties for any leader suggesting withdrawal. Fourth, economic integration that treaty cooperation enables creates commercial interests in continued coordination because businesses that develop trading relationships, investment partnerships, and supply chains within treaty member bloc benefit from sustained cooperation and lobby governments for continued coordination. Resource exporters that redirected sales from Western markets to treaty partners depend on continued access. Manufacturers that sourced inputs from other signatories depend on continued supply chains. Investors that placed capital in partner nations depend on continued stability. The commercial interests create powerful lobbies advocating for treaty continuation and opposing any policies threatening coordination that their business models depend on. Fifth, demonstrated success proving that coordination achieves objectives that individual nations couldn't accomplish independently, creates precedent encouraging sustained cooperation and expansion. Successfully constraining American operations against Iran demonstrates that collective defense works. Successfully coercing American base withdrawals demonstrates that coordination overcomes military superiority. Successfully imposing economic costs through resource restrictions demonstrates that collective leverage exceeds individual bargaining power. Each success builds confidence that continued coordination delivers results, builds momentum for expanding cooperation into additional domains, and builds determination to sustain what success proves effective. The combination means that Treaty I signed isn't temporary arrangement but permanent security architecture that persists through leadership changes, through regional crises, through economic fluctuations, and through shifting international dynamics. You cannot wait for coordination to collapse because institutional factors, operational dependencies, political incentives, economic interests, and demonstrated success all reinforce continued cooperation. You cannot divide signatories because mutual defense obligations make defection catastrophic, and because benefits of membership exceed anything you could offer individual nations for abandoning coordination. You cannot pressure members into withdrawal because collective capabilities enable signatories to resist pressure that isolated nations would yield to, and because resource leverage imposes costs on pressure attempts exceeding costs of resisting pressure. Your only viable option is accepting that global security architecture changed permanently, that your unilateral dominance ended, and that your interests now require operating within multipolar system where other powers possess capabilities constraining your freedom of action. Acceptance requires psychological adjustment that imperial powers historically struggle with because acknowledging constraints feels like accepting defeat. But denial doesn't prevent reality, resistance doesn't restore dominance, and delay merely wastes resources that better serve other priorities. You can accept gracefully by working with emerging powers to construct multilateral frameworks balancing interests, or you can accept painfully after wasting years fighting inevitable transformations. Either way, acceptance is inevitable because alternatives don't exist, enabling restoration of dominance that dissolved when sufficient nations coordinated to constrain your power. I'm publishing this treaty today rather than keeping it classified specifically to prevent your government from claiming ignorance when deciding whether to attack Iran. You'll know that attacking Iran triggers collective defense obligations. You'll know what capabilities I possess for fulfilling obligations. You'll know what economic costs retaliation imposes. You'll know what alliance fractures might result from European refusal supporting operations. You'll know all relevant facts enabling informed decision about whether operations serve American interests considering all consequences. Your leaders who proceed despite knowing consequences cannot later claim they didn't understand implications or didn't anticipate responses. I'm removing any excuse for claiming surprise by providing complete transparency about treaty terms, signatory capabilities, and planned responses. 1 minute ago, I signed the treaty that ends your security dominance. 54 African nations joined without your knowledge. Iran gained continental defense network. Your Iran options narrowed to acceptance or catastrophe. Your global position deteriorated permanently. Your alliances face unprecedented strain. Your economic leverage diminished fatally. And your unipolar moment ended when you stopped paying attention. Test me if you doubt my resolve. Attack Iran and trigger obligations I detailed explicitly. Impose sanctions and lose resources you need desperately. Attempt dividing us and discover that pressure strengthens rather than weakens resolve. Every response you imagine fails because I prepared for each before signing treaty that renders them ineffective. Your dominance ended. Your choice is accepting gracefully or resisting painfully. Either way, outcome is certain because power shifted and no policy reverses transformations that sufficient coordination creates. This is what multipolarity looks like when emerging nations coordinate systematically rather than resisting individually. This is what your decline looks like when alternatives mature sufficiently that your threats lose coercive power. This is what the future looks like where multiple powers constrain each other rather than single hegemon imposing preferences globally. Accept it or fight it, but understand that fighting delays acceptance without preventing outcome because I built architecture sustaining coordination regardless of your resistance. Welcome to the world that treaty created, where attacking Iran means fighting Africa, where imposing sanctions means losing resources, where pressuring allies means alliance fracture, where demonstrating strength means revealing weakness, where unilateral dominance is history and multilateral negotiation is future. Adjust your strategy or exhaust your resources, proving that resistance fails. Your choice determines cost, but not outcome, because outcome is predetermined by capabilities, coordination, and collective commitment that treaty formalizes. 1 minute ago, everything changed. You just haven't accepted it yet, but you will, either through wisdom accepting reality or through experience teaching lessons that wisdom should have prevented. Either way, you'll accept because alternatives don't exist, enabling restoration of what treaty ended permanently.